strong political beliefs have probably found yourself at times talking to someone with the opposite beliefs of you. And your conversation probably went something like this. You stated your belief and the facts that back that up. And then the other person states their opposing belief and the facts that back that up. And then the two of you argue over who's right. But where has that conversation left you? At the end of that, do you feel like you're more open to seeing the other person's point of view? Are you more interested in working together with this person, in cooperating with this person? If the answer is yes, then that is awesome. That's great. But if the answer is no, that's all right. For many of us, for most of us, the answer is no. And what does that mean? That means that at the end of those conversations, more often than not, I feel more disconnected from the other person. I feel even more like I'm right and my opponent is wrong. See, even there, I've made the subtle shift of seeing this other person as my opponent, my enemy, that I have to defeat, that I have to prove is wrong in order to get my agenda, my conception of the good, passed. And so if that's an experience that you and I are having, then let's just wonder about what the experience is like to be within the chambers of Congress, to be one of the presidential candidates. What politicians say and do in public light demonstrates and models for the rest of us how to have a political discourse. And what is it that they're modeling? Well, they're modeling that the way to have a political discourse is to prove that my beliefs, my plan, my strategies are morally superior. And if I can convince enough people that my ideas are morally superior to my opponents, then it doesn't matter how many needs are left unmet along the way. And so I want to show that there is another way that we can do this. That there's another way to have political conversations with people that invites honesty and empathy. Put another way, I want to show how nonviolent communication can be so useful in the political arena. And to show that, I've taken a few clips from the first presidential debate. I'm going to show, to give some context, we're joining the debate right in the middle of the discussion on healthcare. And I'm going to show Romney responding to Obama's opening speech, and then Obama's response to Romney. After each clip, I'm going to break down some of the words that each individual used that would trigger the fight, flight, or freeze reaction in a listener. And then I'm going to model how the other person could empathically respond to them using NVC principles. I hope you enjoy.
First of all, I like the way we did it in Massachusetts. I like the fact that in my state we had Republicans and Democrats come together and work together. What you did instead was to push through a plan without a single Republican vote. As a matter of fact, when Massachusetts did something quite extraordinary, elected a Republican senator to stop Obamacare, you pushed it through anyway. So entirely on a partisan basis, instead of bringing America together and having a discussion on this important topic, you pushed through something that you and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid thought was the best answer and drove it through. What we did in a legislature, 87% Democrat, we were together. 200 legislators in my legislature, only 2 voted against the plan by the time we were finished. What were some differences? We didn't raise taxes. You've raised them by $1 trillion under Obamacare. We didn't cut Medicare. Of course, we don't have Medicare, but we didn't cut Medicare by $716 billion. We didn't put in place a board that can tell people ultimately what treatments they're going to receive. We didn't also do something that I think a number of people across this country recognize, which is put people in a position where they're going to lose the insurance they had and they wanted. Right now, the CBO says up to 20 million people will lose their insurance as Obamacare goes into effect next year. And likewise, a study by McKinsey and Company of American businesses said 30% of them are anticipating dropping people from coverage. So for those reasons, for the tax, for Medicare, for this board, and for people losing their insurance, this is why the American people don't want Medicare, don't want Obamacare. It's why Republicans said, do not do this. And the Republicans had the plan. They put a plan out. They put out a plan, a bipartisan plan. It was swept aside. I think something this big, this important, has to be done on a bipartisan basis. And we have to have a president who can reach across the aisle and fashion important legislation with the input from both parties.
Okay, welcome back. So I'm first going to identify some of the things that Romney said that would trigger the fight, flight, or freeze reaction in someone who identifies as a Democrat. When Romney says things like, Obama drove this bill through, or Reid and Pelosi pushed this bill through, he's making an evaluation based on an observation. The observation might be that this bill passed through Congress, or that even this bill passed through Congress without any Republican members voting for it. But the evaluation is the word drove through, or pushed through. Those terms imply that this legislation, that the Democratic agenda, is being pushed against the will of Congress. And Romney even takes it a step further when later on he says, the American people don't want this. And when he says that, he implies that this legislation, this agenda, is against the will of the public. Well, that is certainly going to trigger the fight reaction out of a Democrat. Or maybe the flight reaction where they might throw their hands up in disgust and just walk away. But Romney doesn't only trigger the fight, flight, or freeze reaction in Democrats. He also says a few things that would trigger that reaction in any voter. When he says this bill will raise taxes, and that it will cut Medicare, and that it creates an unelected board, all of these statements trigger the fight, flight, and freeze reaction in Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And it does that by aiming at their fear, by triggering one's fear that they are not safe, that they're not going to be able to enjoy the same liberties, the same benefits that they're enjoying right now. And that fear can quickly become a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And let's not forget that the fight, flight, freeze reaction makes it so much harder for us to connect with one another and to employ our empathy skills. So, now I'd like to model how Obama could respond to Romney in such a way that it avoids all those triggering words and speaks to Romney's true needs, while also expressing Obama's needs. It would maybe go something like this. Mr. Romney, I can really see how sad and frustrated you are that there wasn't more cooperation in the process of crafting this legislation. I'm guessing that you really think we came up with some strategies that won't meet everyone's needs. And maybe if we had worked harder at achieving cooperation, we would find those strategies that would meet everyone's needs. And I really appreciate that you also desire some acknowledgement that the bill you supported in Massachusetts and my legislation are different. Namely, you see your legislation as aimed at and concerned about fiscal responsibility, while my legislation is not. But you also want to make clear that your interest at heart lies with making sure health care reform benefits the well-being of others. Well, let me assure you, I too want to ensure the well-being, the health of all of our citizens. And it's very important to me that we have legislation that ensures the well-being and the health of all. And I see that as really happening by making some improvements to our current system. Namely, I think that if we can find ways to make our current system more efficient, then we'll be able to help people save more money on the cost of their insurance. And thus, we can ensure more fiscal responsibility for everyone. But I not only want to make sure that I'm reducing the cost of healthcare for those who already have healthcare, I also want to ensure that those who don't have healthcare find the means to get healthcare. And that's how I believe we can ensure the health and well-being of all of our citizens. Now, let's see how Obama really
Governor Romney
responded.
said this has to be done on a bipartisan basis. This was a bipartisan idea. In fact, it was a Republican idea. And Governor Romney, at the beginning of this debate, wrote and said, what we did in Massachusetts could be a model for the nation. And I agree that the Democratic legislators in Massachusetts might have given some advice to Republicans in Congress about how to cooperate. But the fact of the matter is, we use the same advisors, and they say it's the same plan. When Governor Romney talks about this board, for example, unelected board that we've created, what this is a group of healthcare experts, doctors, et cetera, to figure out how can we reduce the cost of care in the system overall. Because there are two ways of dealing with our healthcare crisis. One is to simply leave a whole bunch of people uninsured and let them fend for themselves, to let businesses figure out how long they can continue to pay premiums until finally they just give up and their workers are no longer getting insured. And that's been the trend line. Or alternatively, we can figure out how do we make the cost of care more effective. And there are ways of doing it. So at Cleveland Clinic, one of the best healthcare systems in the world, they actually provide great care cheaper than average. And the reason they do is because they do some smart things. They say, if a patient's coming in, let's get all the doctors together at once, do one test instead of having the patient run around with 10 tests. Let's make sure that we're providing preventive care, so we're catching the onset of something like diabetes. Let's pay providers on the basis of performance as opposed to on the basis of how many procedures they've engaged in. Now, so what this board does is basically identifies best practices and says, let's use the purchasing power of Medicare and Medicaid to help to institutionalize all these good things that we do. And the fact of the matter is that when Obamacare is fully implemented, we're going to be in a position to show that costs are going down. And over the last 2 years, healthcare premiums have gone up. It's true, but they've gone up slower than any time in the last 50 years. So we're already beginning to see progress. In the meantime, folks out there with insurance, you're already getting a rebate. Let me make one last point. Governor Romney says we should replace it. I'm just going to repeal it, but we can replace it with something. But the problem is he hasn't described what exactly we'd replace it with, other than saying we're going to leave it to the states. But the fact of the matter is that some of the prescriptions that he's offered, like letting you buy insurance across state lines, there's no indication that that somehow is going to help somebody who's got a pre-existing condition be able to finally buy insurance. In fact, it's estimated that by repealing Obamacare, you're looking at 50 million people losing health insurance at a time when it's vitally important.
Let's let the governor.
Welcome back. I'm going to again begin by pointing out what phrases and words Obama uses that would trigger the fight, flight, and freeze reaction in a listener. When Obama says that the only alternative to healthcare reform is to leave people uninsured and to figure it out themselves, he sets up a false dichotomy. He sets up this dichotomy that the only options are his healthcare legislation or that people stay uninsured with no help and there's no change. This immediately triggers a fight reaction in Republicans who want to demonstrate that there are more options than just these two. And it triggers a fear reaction in Democrats and independents who now view the world in these two stark black and white choices. And they either need to run away or freeze up in response to this stark world. And Obama again triggers this when he states that Romney hasn't shown what his proposal is for healthcare reform. But it's interesting because Obama also triggers the fight, flight, and freeze reaction by saying something that Romney said earlier. Early Romney said that under this legislation, people will lose their health insurance. Well, Obama says that if this legislation is repealed, quote, 50 million Americans will lose their insurance. That triggers the fear in all of us, the fear that we will lose our personal freedoms, our personal lifestyles that we're used to, the certain benefits and privileges that we have currently become accustomed to. And so when both of them trigger that fear, it triggers a fight or a flight or a freeze reaction that makes it so hard to connect empathically with the other person. So, let me now model how Romney could have responded to Obama by first acknowledging Obama's needs and then moving on to expressing Romney's own needs. It may have gone a little something like this. Mr. Obama, I really understand that you'd like more clarity and honesty in this debate. And I can really appreciate that. Specifically, you'd like there to be more acknowledgement of the similarities between your legislation and the legislation that I passed in Massachusetts. However, I too, for the sake of clarity and honesty, want to acknowledge that there are also some differences between your legislation and my own. And I also want to acknowledge that I can really hear how much you're looking to improve the system, to lower costs for people, in order that we can ensure the well-being and health of all citizens. I have that need too, but unfortunately I feel scared when I hear you speak and look at your legislation. I'm scared because I don't think your legislation ensures that. I'm anxious because I don't see your bill as fiscally responsible. When we're cutting Medicare and cutting taxes, or raising taxes and cutting Medicare, I'm really worried that that isn't fiscally responsible and it isn't ensuring the well-being of all Americans. And the real lack of cooperation in how this legislation got passed really leaves me dismayed over all the alternative strategies that were passed over without even a vote. And so, I'd really like to see if you and I, if the Democrats and the Republicans could work together to find some solutions that really ensure the needs for well-being and health for all of our citizens, while also ensuring the fiscal responsibility of our country and our citizens. And that's how I believe we can ensure the well-being of all. So thank you for watching, and I hope you found this exercise really helpful in seeing ways that we can look past fight, flight, or freeze reactions and empathically respond to and connect to the needs that are underlying all of our political discussions.